Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Garrity.
And welcome, everyone, to the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. David French of National Review is in for Jim Garrity today. Jim is off on jury duty, so we'll see if he can make that a one-day affair. We should have some interesting stories about that whenever he does return. Hopefully that'll be tomorrow. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. I don't know if you've started your holiday shopping season yet. I don't know what I've gotten yet except for a cold over the Thanksgiving Day break, but we will persist, as Mitch McConnell said about Elizabeth Warren. David, great to have you with us as always.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Much appreciated.
Well, let's start with our good martini, of course. We have good, bad, and crazy today, but it's kind of a double-headed good with a potentially bitter aftertaste. So let's start with the part that's actually good. Washington Post. Senate Democrats' midterm losses have created a dilemma for the party's leadership over a key committee seat held by Senator Kamala Harris of California, a prospective 2020 presidential contender who is at risk of having to forfeit the high-profile assignment and the national spotlight that comes with it. Harris, a former prosecutor and state attorney general, is the Senate Judiciary Committee's most junior member. The panel's investigations and Supreme Court confirmation battles have commanded regular media coverage since President Trump entered the Oval Office. It's the kind of exposure a new senator usually could only dream of, and with everything from an attorney general confirmation to oversight of special counsel Robert S. Mueller III's Russia probe on next year's agenda, its limelight won't fade soon. Yet, unless Democrats strike a deal, either with the Senate's Republican majority or with fellow Democrats on the committee, numbers and seniority dictate that Harris will be out. And that has liberal groups scrambling to save her position. Brian Fallon is executive director of Demand Justice. He's also Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign spokesman. He says not only would it be unconscionable to remove the only African-American woman from the committee, but Senator Harris is also the most skilled questioner on the panel. The Washington Post goes on to say that she displayed this talent during the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, which, if I remember correctly, David, is when she accused him of openly aiding efforts to undermine the Mueller investigation, which a quick check of the facts showed that he had nothing to do with that whatsoever. So obviously a bigger majority means that Republicans get bigger and wider majorities on the committees as well, which means the Democrats lose a seat. And if a grandstander like Kamala Harris has to step away, it's not going to break our hearts at all.
No, it will not break our hearts. This is going to be very, very interesting because you're going to have a collision between the progressive activist imperative and the self-interest of the individual senators, because unless they strike a deal and they depart from current practice, as you were just saying, she's likely off the committee. But for the progressive activists, that's intolerable. She's the new, improved, better version of Elizabeth Warren, and she will not be sidelined. This is a person who's arguably one of the most credible presidential contenders for 2020. Probably the most credible of the truly progressive contenders for 2020. And so this could very well turn into a pretty contentious battle because not too many senators would like to and would want to give up a plum seat on the key committee in the Senate, or one of the key committees on the Senate, so that someone else can shine. That's not necessarily in the DNA of your typical senator. So we'll see. And, it's issues like this that are one of the reasons why, even though the Democrats did quite well in the midterms, and turns out that they did better than we thought, in the days immediately after the midterms, just as all the votes have been counted and the full scale of Republican losses have been revealed. There's still not the kind of celebration you would typically expect because of these Senate losses. And not just the Senate losses, but also, I think, because of the losses of some of the big high-profile progressive candidates. And with Gillum going down, with Stacey Abrams going down, with Beto O'Rourke going down, that means that Kamala Harris is one of the last progressive superstars still standing. So let me just say it will be interesting being a spectator.
Well, that's certainly the case. But when you think of all the, let's just say, personalities on the Democratic side of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which we became so familiar with in the month of September, I don't see a lot of small egos there who would be willing to step aside. Obviously, Spartacus isn't going to do that. And Dick Blumenthal, Mazie Hirono, they've built their profiles a little bit. And Dianne Feinstein, obviously, is still going to be the ranking member. So do you see anybody on there who's actually got a shred of humility that would actually step aside so the Democrats can have their demographic wish list on this panel?
There isn't a name jumping out at me. I mean, each one of these people, they believe. Let's just put it this way. Let's instead of casting aspersions on their motives, let's think the best of them. And here's how I would run through the analysis if I was a senator considering this. I would say, I've been elected to represent my constituents. I've worked hard for a very long time in the Senate to provide my constituents a voice. One of the most important committees in the entire United States Senate is Judiciary. I give my constituents a voice in the most important committee in the Senate. I'm not going to hurt my constituents by stepping aside.
It could all be moot because that we're assuming right now that the Republicans are going to have 53 senators in the next Congress. Right now, they're guaranteed 52 now that everything's all buttoned up in Florida and Rick Scott is officially senator-elect. But there's one Senate race left, and that's going to happen this week. I believe it's tomorrow on the Mississippi runoff. This is due to the fact that Thad Cochran, who was reelected for the umpteenth time back in 2014 in declining health earlier this year, stepped aside. The Republican governor there appointed a woman named Cindy Hyde-Smith. She was a state official in Mississippi. She's a former Democrat, but became a Republican several years back. She was in a three-way kind of jungle primary on Election Day back in November, on November 6th, against Chris McDaniel, who almost beat Thad Cochran in a primary back in 2014, as well as Mike Espy, the Democratic candidate in this race and the former secretary in the Clinton administration. So now McDaniel is out. Republicans thought that he was just too much of a risk. He was losing head-to-head against Mike Espy. And so they went with Hyde-Smith. And I haven't seen any polling here, David, but the coverage of this race is basically one perceived gaffe on the part of Cindy Hyde-Smith after another. Most significant is when she said, when defending a friend of hers, that, quote, I would fight a circular saw for him if he invited me to a public hanging. I'd be on the front row, unquote. The Democrats immediately decided that was a reference to lynching, which they also immediately decided Cindy Hyde-Smith was okay with. So, David, stupid comments don't necessarily equal racist comments. And so the Democrats are trying to make hay where they can in a state that's obviously not tilting in their direction normally with races. But this is obviously close enough that President Trump is making two stops there today. So what do you make of this race, and how big of a black eye is this if the Republicans can't win it?
Well, I don't think the race is any real danger. I think that there was a poll released today that showed for Republicans, it's not in any real danger, that showed her up by about 10 points. I would be surprised if she won by less than 5. This is no Roy Moore situation here. Let's just put it that way. She does not have the kind of record that Roy Moore had. She does not have the kind of allegations against her that Roy Moore had. There seem to be 3 big things that they're using against her. One is the hanging comment, which is a really awkward way of expressing personal admiration for somebody.
Yes.
That's no question about that. I think it's a big stretch to say that she's then therefore for lynching.
Right.
I think what she's saying is she would endure some really, really unpleasant things for him. She was not celebrating those events. She was saying she would endure really unpleasant things for this guy. So it's a super awkward comment. She's also under fire for some pictures she took at the Jefferson Davis Museum several years ago. And then she's under fire lately because her parents sent her to one of these what are called segregation academies, these all-white schools, private schools that sprang up after the desegregation order. I'm not quite sure how much she can be blamed for going to the school her parents sent her to. But this is the kind of thing that we're seeing that's kind of politics as usual in an age of identity politics, which is looking for things that an opponent has done and then that are arguably racially insensitive, and then reading the absolute worst possible motive into them. That this is a person who loves the Confederacy, who is fine with lynchings, and fled and by her own volition and her own free choice as a fully formed human being as a child, fled integrated schools so that she didn't have to learn alongside black schoolmates. So we take each of these things, and what ends up happening is then people try to paint this really grotesque picture, and that's not warranted by the facts. It is, but again, I mean, this is sort of business as usual. It's part of the painting that we just saw of Ron DeSantis as some sort of terrible, vicious racist when he's not. But yeah, this is kind of par for the course now. But I don't think that she's in any danger. Again, this is a person who is very different from Roy Moore. She's more of what I would say just sort of mainline establishment Republican who's done kind of mainline establishment Republican things in the Deep South. I mean, it's going to be hard to find too many older Republicans in particular who haven't gone to a Confederate museum or been to Confederate memorials. This is part of the history in the South. And I mean, my goodness, I've been to countless battlefields myself. I've been to homes of Confederate leaders during my childhood and my adulthood. I mean, this is part of the history of this region, and going to a museum is not an endorsement of slavery, and going to a museum is not an endorsement of insurrection. The idea that that's her position, or that she's marked or characterized by that kind of position in public life, I think is a real stretch.
So if you go to Arlington National Cemetery and tour the Lee House, don't take any pictures, or at least don't put them on social media. Your political career is destroyed.
Right,
potentially,
exactly.
potentially. So, well, if you like the activities of the social justice warriors on that story, just wait till our final one. This one's getting way, way, way out of hand. But in the meantime, let's turn to our bad martini and our good old friend John Kasich, and this certainly has a strong strain of crazy to it as well. John Kasich ran for president for about 10 minutes back in 1999. He, of course, ran for president in 2016 and stayed in a ridiculously long amount of time. So it's the only one Ohio. Now he's making noise of doing it again. We don't know whether he'd run as a Republican in a primary against President Trump or would run as a third party, but he's still talking about it very publicly. Did it again this weekend with George Stephanopoulos on ABC's This Week program. So Stephanopoulos asking him right out of the gate, are you thinking about doing this again in 2020?
How seriously are you thinking about taking it on this time?
Very seriously. I'm considering it, George. These are earnest conversations that go on virtually every day with some of my friends, with my family.
And then he talks about his motivation if he does do it.
So the question for me is, what do I do about this? Is it, what exactly do I run because I've determined that I can win? Or is it important for me to make such a good showing that I can send a message that can disrupt the political system in this country?
If only we had someone on the podcast today who's considered running for president against fairly long odds. David French, yes. David, what do you make of John Kasich? As Jim likes to say, he proved in 2016 he's the perfect candidate to be president of Ohio and not much else. What do you think is going on here? Just a gadfly trying to sabotage Trump if he runs third party? Ultimately, what's at work here?
You don't like to ascribe bad motives to somebody, but I feel like we've got a little bit of hubris going on here. I feel like we had a little bit of hubris going on in 2016. Look, this is a guy who, by all rights, should have dropped out of the race right after the New Hampshire primary. I mean, this is a guy who had his strategy was obviously failing by that point. It was obvious that he was an also ran in the next many primaries moving forward. It was obvious that he had no real shot at the nomination, but he hung in there siphoning off votes for a very long time. I mean, not siphoning off enough to be a factor for himself, but siphoning off enough to be a factor for Donald Trump for a very, very long time. Now, he wasn't the only offender as far as people who stayed in the race too long, but he was arguably the worst offender. And if you're going to look at any one Republican in the 2016 primary who helped facilitate the rise of Donald Trump by his own choices, his own decision-making, his own hubris, I would say John Kasich is near the top of that list. And if you want to talk about the profile of Republicans who are who are likely to try to actually unseat a Donald Trump, I would say that John Kasich is near the bottom of that list. So he's kind of the answer to the question nobody is asking. And so I don't know what he's seeing that leads him to believe that he should do this. I don't know what kind of indication he has that he has what it takes, either as from a third party perspective or from a Republican primary perspective to unseat Trump. But which John Kasich is going to run here? I mean, as far as the image that he presents to the public, because one of the realities about Kasich is when he ran in 2016, he presented a very different image to the public than he presents in private, where he's known to be quite the prickly politician, quite, and in many ways, often arrogant and condescending. And he sort of ran as this kumbaya guy who's going to, give out hugs as freely and indiscriminately. It just wasn't all that sincere. So I'm not quite sure what he's hoping to accomplish, unless he's wanting to simply accomplish beating Donald Trump or taking enough support away from Donald Trump to guarantee that he loses. And honestly, that's one of the reasons why in my super mega super long shot consideration of my super long shot third party run back in 2016, I realized that to the extent that I would have any effect at all, which would have been a very much of an open question, it would have been to help elect Hillary Clinton. And now, of course, he's got a far greater platform than I ever did. But I think to the extent that he would have any impact at all, it would be to elect a Democrat. And maybe that's his intent. I don't know, but I doubt it. I think he actually thinks he can be president. But again, I think he is the answer to the question no one is asking.
Very well put. David, when you were calculating whether or not to run as a third-party candidate in 2016, I'm curious what you thought was the ceiling on this, because in reading about Kasich, apparently he believes that if the Democrats nominate someone pretty far to the left like Elizabeth Warren, that creates so much polarization with Trump and Warren in the race that leaves about 25% or so that are actively looking for another candidate. The flip side of that is that's not going to happen. You'd be more like 5%, because ultimately people who don't like either, just like in 2016, are going to pick one of the two people they don't like.
Yeah, I think that the 25% number is a theoretical ceiling. I would even say higher than that, maybe even 30%, but I don't think it's a ceiling. I don't think that's a realistic number for an existing known establishment kind of politician. I mean, he's known as a Republican establishment politician. This is not the fresh face that a lot of the people who are yearning for something different are looking for. He's just not. I think if you look back on third party runs, I think what the theoretical, you were seeing the sort of the theoretical apex in Ross Perot before he dropped out.
Yeah.
So who was Ross Perot before he dropped out? Before he dropped out, he was a guy who was not easy to peg ideologically. He was an interesting public personality, an interesting public character. He was coming from outside of the political process. He had a very compelling biography, including some elements of his biography that spoke very highly about his character. For example, the way he had worked so diligently to bring some of his employees out of Iran after the fall of the Shah. And so here you had this outsider, compelling biography, compelling personality, not easily pigeonholed ideologically. And he was around a third of the electorate. He had around a third of the electorate before he dropped out for very weird and mysterious reasons. That's not John Kasich. John Kasich is sort of your establishment Republican governor. And when I was looking at the third party run, there was a really interesting difference in the polling numbers between a person who came from outside of establishment politics and a person who was coming from inside establishment politics. The theoretical support for a third party run, a third party candidate, dropped precipitously if that third party candidate was perceived as a political insider. So he defines political insiders. So I think his theoretical ceiling as a third party candidate is he would just be a guy that's sort of where you park your votes as a protest. And the number of people who are willing to just simply park their votes as a protest in any given election is pretty small. Now it's large enough to sway a close election, but it's not a large enough number to make him an independent contender for the presidency.
All right, let's go to our crazy martini now. This is from The Blaze. Twitter has banned the practice of misgendering, as well as a term it calls dead naming, in an effort to crack down on offending transgender people. Misgendering is the practice of referring to a person with a pronoun, like he or she, that does not correlate with the person's gender identity. For example, calling a woman if she says she's a man. The term dead naming means to use a transgender person's former name instead of their new chosen name. In response to the myriad offenses engaging in such practices, Twitter has decided to ban misgendering and dead naming. The company reportedly rolled out the policy in October, but the update only gained momentum over the last couple of weeks. That's part of the hateful conduct policy that they keep suspending and banning people for without actually really defining what it is. And I believe a few conservatives have now been banned. We'll see if it's temporary or permanent as a result of not abiding by this. Ben Shapiro with a tweet saying, so Twitter is now banning people for stating the basic scientific fact that men are men and women are women, and that men cannot become women simply by thinking themselves so. Twitter versus reality. So, David, we've talked about this in the context of some cities looking to make it a crime and fining people, possibly jailing people for doing this, which I think is far more egregious than Twitter suspending your account. But clearly there's momentum behind this ideology.
Absolutely. There's tremendous momentum. And I just tweeted right before we recorded this podcast that the real significance of this Twitter move echoes beyond Twitter, because what it does is it reinforces the notion that every serious corporate entity in the U.S., along with, as you noted, city or state governments, should step in essentially and cut off public dialogue and discussion of these issues, or at least regulate the terms of the dialogue and the debate such that one side has to essentially grant the premises of the other side to even engage in a discussion. So that, you're going to use the pronoun she to describe Caitlyn Jenner, which is if you're calling Caitlyn Jenner she, you're granting, you're acquiescing to Jenner's self-description, even if you don't believe it to be true. I've written about this extensively, and the fact of the matter is, I think as a state or local government imposes these pronoun requirements, that it should be held unconstitutional. And in fact, there is at least one case that I know of where a professor was punished simply for refusing to use a chosen pronoun, and has filed a First Amendment lawsuit. And it's going to be very interesting to see where that goes, because requiring someone to use a pronoun that you do not believe accurately depicts that person is a form of compelled speech. And compelled speech is usually subject to the most exacting forms of scrutiny. Rarely survives a compelled speech rule, rarely survives First Amendment challenge. It's hard to think of one in recent times that has survived First Amendment challenge. And so, that's what we're talking about here. Is Twitter is trying, at least on its own platform, it's not the government, of course, but on its own platform, it's trying to force people to engage in compelled speech. And this is something that is, and on a matter for which, by the way, there is an incredibly lively and important public debate about the science and the philosophy and the religious implications of this enormously significant social change that is saying that a man or a woman is not defined by biology, but in essence by mindset. And that's something, look, at the very least, is that not worth an extensive discussion before we're going to acquiesce to that notion? But time and again, these companies, and this is a symbol of how these companies are ideological monocultures, because in a company with a diverse internal perspective on issues like this, you don't see a policy like this implemented. You just flat out don't, because you know and you understand that these debates are far from settled. But this is a product of the monoculture we're seeing increasingly in these big tech companies and elsewhere. They have decided the debate internally, and they're going to try to decide it for the rest of us.
And any dissension gets you called a hateful bigot. Like you said, there's no room for the debate, so therefore anyone who has an honest disagreement just gets branded in a ridiculously inaccurate way.
Yes, exactly. And they view it as the only possible reason to disagree with the progressive ideology and the sexual revolution, especially around these transgender issues or issues of sexuality and gender identity, that the only possible reason is that you are a bigot, that you are a person who's just hateful. When in fact, the fact of the matter is, I can believe and know that a fellow human being is created in the image of God and want nothing but the best for them and nothing but the best for their life, and believe that they should be entitled to all of the same rights that I am entitled to as a citizen of this country. But I'm sorry, I can also say that I don't believe a man can get pregnant, and that teaching people otherwise can be actually harmful to them. And it can be harmful to teach things contrary to this reality. And yet that's deemed to be bigoted just because I have that view, even when my view is it could be very, very deeply harmful to people to teach them that they're actually and truly a woman trapped in a man's body. That the idea that that's just bigoted to think in any terms, I think that's ridiculous.
Thank you, as always, for filling in for Jim. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me.
David French of National Review, in for Jim Garrity today. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Tune in again on Tuesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.